Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. Gain valuable insights by attending the podcast, then complete the assessment test to download your certificate. To do this, follow these simple steps. Click on the link in your description to access the session. Create a free account and attend the podcast. After the podcast, take the assessment test and download your certificate. It's easy, and it's free. We highly recommend checking out our subscription.
Well, since we're talking about legislation, moving on to legislation, which is your forte, what are some common challenges you've encountered while drafting legislation for the new cannabis markets?
So the hardest thing about working with legislature or working with legislation is getting in what you want, right? And so every time you're approached by legislators or you're approached by trade groups, and they say, well, what do we want in there? And so we can say everything that we want, but it's like a Christmas list, right? And it looks beautiful when you hand it over, but what you might get over time has to change or compromises and so forth. And a lot of times that can happen fast, and you have to kind of be involved in the process. I think the saying goes something to the effect of, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
And you mentioned about 280E, right? I know it's a very big topic, and I would not want you to tell me everything about it, because that would probably take another, many hours. But, for the uninitiated, because, there are going to be people who are still trying to understand this industry. What is this 280E, and why is it important for the industry?
I'm not a tax lawyer, so I'll limit my statements to a very broad view of it, which is to say that it's what it says is that if you're engaged in federally illegal conduct, you do not get to use tax write-offs that a normal ordinary business would get to write off. So each year I get to write off certain things because I'm a business, and so certain percentages of what I do get written off. And cannabis companies do not get to do that. They do not get to use those.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm your host, Saul, and today joining us is a special guest who has been a beacon in the legal landscape of the burgeoning cannabis industry. He's a trailblazer, a staunch advocate of equitable business practices, and a pioneer in cannabis legislation. Please welcome Aaron Pelley, a leading authority on cannabis law and practice. Aaron, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you for having me. I look forward to doing this today.
Absolutely, absolutely. Aaron has been instrumental in shaping cannabis legislation and has first-hand experience with the evolution of the cannabis market across various states. Today, he'll share his insights on the challenges, the strategies, and what he sees on the horizon for this dynamic field. So let's dive right in. Aaron, the cannabis industry has seen significant growth and changes over the years. Could you describe some of the key milestones that have shaped the evolution of the cannabis markets in the United States?
Sure. Obviously, we had a long period of prohibition there that started back in the 1920s by a guy named Anslinger, who essentially pushed forward this principled idea that we needed to have cannabis be illegal. Instead of calling it cannabis, he called it marijuana, and was able to make quite a bit of headway. I think that if he had been more honest and called it cannabis, most people would have objected to it, because most people had cannabis or cannabis products in their medicine cabinets at that time. They were using it medicinally throughout kind of the United States. But he came up with all of these kind of very racist associations with marijuana being associated with Black people, that it led to interracial relationships and all just terrible stuff. And so it stuck. And then it got further perpetuated under the Nixon era, where they essentially, Nixon couldn't make being Black or brown illegal, and he couldn't make being, a liberal illegal, but he could make marijuana more illegal. And therein came the war on drugs. And so the war on drugs has been now marked as a complete disaster. And over time, and it was a really progressive time, was in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it was a lot of the people that were in the AIDS epidemic that were using cannabis to kind of treat themselves and others as medicinally necessary. And what happened was they kind of ushered in this era of acceptance. And you kind of fast forward to today, and even though several people in legislature and in government are holding on to this, cannabis is no different than heroin, or cannabis is bad for you, the truth of the matter is that medicinal marijuana is arguably more popular than Democrats and Republicans polled combined. The combined rate for them is quite low. I think the acceptance rate for medical marijuana is in the high 70s, like 78, 79. And for medicinal, it's kind of always been clocking in somewhere between 48 and 56%. I'm sorry, for recreational, it's been clocking about 48 to 56%. So that's kind of as a background of where we're at today in terms of acceptance. We're still kind of, a lot of the accepting of this, it tends to follow along, it's strangely kind of political lines. So you will see your redder states less acceptant of this, and your bluer states more acceptant of it. But you really do see that on the medicinal side of cannabis, it transcends politics or parties. People just know that this drug isn't hurting anybody. And most people know that it certainly doesn't belong in a Schedule I, which is where it is today, which is to say that the federal government believes that under the law, that there's no medicinal purpose for cannabis, and it is the most dangerous drug in the world. So we're waiting for those changes progressively to happen, and it's certainly in this experiment in the state-by-state markets, we're seeing them make those changes.
That's fascinating. It's fascinating to see how different states have approached the regulation and the legalization of cannabis. So what can we learn from these variations?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, so it really has kind of been all over the board. The legalizations that happened at the beginning were actually happening through voter legislation. So the voters would basically say, we want to pass this, because the legislature didn't really have the backbone to do it. But a lot of legislatures now are stepping in. They're seeing that the sky isn't falling when we legalize cannabis. And in fact, we can do this without, in fact, that there's more benefits than harms. All the harms that we were concerned about, when you look at the measurable harms, the biggest one was like, what about the children? And what we've seen is there's been no change in youth use in states where things are legalized. But however, we've seen huge changes in what happens in the criminal justice system, what's happening in the money that's saved in not prosecuting these cases. And then likewise in the amount of resources that are gained through taxing and so forth. So I would say that the rollout each state, you would think it would get better and better, but it kind of ends up being a mess in its own way in every state. I think the biggest progressions that we've seen in terms of how things are being done are is the social equity element, and that is to say that those people, giving some of those people that were most harmed by the war on drugs the opportunity to get into this industry. What you saw with Colorado and Washington State, and then some of the first states to come online, was that it was dominated by white people with money. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of states trying to find a way to capitalize on the knowledge that that's what's happening. How do we allow or give these people the opportunity to not be, to do something with this? These people were the most harmed by this war on drugs, yet they're the first ones that are being pushed out of it. So each state is kind of coming up with their own model, and I think each other state gets the opportunity to learn what was good about that and what was bad. And so it is a progress. I've seen states like Washington and California where Washington is a good example of, like, we limited the number of licenses that we let come out according to population. And then Oregon said, why should we do that? Why wouldn't we treat it like any other business? Let's let the free hand of the market decide how many of these businesses can be out there. And so each one of those ideas has its pros and cons, and it'll be interesting to see how the other states continue to roll this out and what works and what doesn't. The biggest thing that we've seen is the residency requirement, which is kind of been a consistent thing. And without boring you, because I know this isn't a legal podcast, but it's most people would agree it's not constitutional, but most states agree or do it anyways because there's a policy theory behind it, which is we don't want to let everybody from every other state come in and do this. We want to get the people that are in our state, that are in either these black or these gray markets, the illicit markets or these gray markets, and move them into this new recreational market. So that's why they do these, what I consider probably unconstitutional residency requirements, because it's mostly accountants that are on this program, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and they're definitely have their work kind of cut out for them, because the tax part of this is 280E, and for accountants there is a huge opportunity every time a new state comes online. So, for example, our firm is has opened an office in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is going to have new cannabis laws written here in the next probably 8 months, where they're going to have a whole new market of people that are going to be engaged in commerce. And so it's not like every other commerce out there stream is kind of already settled. You know what I mean? The last big commerce stream that wasn't settled would be .com. And that kind of happened everywhere all at the same time, right? Whereas with cannabis, it's a state by state rollout. So accountants have this wonderful opportunity to go into this new market, for example, Minneapolis, or I don't know if I go to New York because it's such a mess, but Florida is about to come online. So these new markets where these people need this legal help from accountants, because the first thing that as attorneys, when we get hired and we're working with our clients, we tell our clients is the first thing you need is an accountant, because you guys have real accounting issues. There's all of these things that have to do with 280E, which there's no write-offs for these cannabis companies, and also they've got, cost of goods sold might be the only thing that they have going for them. It can just be, but there's all of these things that accountants that work in this area of 280E and understand some of these cannabis laws can provide so much opportunity for these people. And without them, I've seen, in some clients, they can get taxed at like 80%. Can you imagine trying to run a business where for every dollar that you get, you only get 20 cents out of it, and that you're going to be able to survive? I mean, it's just almost impossibly hard to survive in this industry without an accountant helping guide you through the best ways for your company to survive.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, like majorly accountants, but this topic is, the best part of my podcast is that it's attended by so many different areas, because it's so much knowledge oriented. So, but
good.
yeah, but you bring out, I mean, this is very alarming, what you brought point over, what you brought to notice, the need for the accountant. But let's stick to, I will definitely want to stick to, your expertise. So.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I just kind of went off on my own. I'm saying they need accountants, not me, but I have my own expertise for sure.
No, I mean, like, I would love to know more about that residency thing that you talked about, because, I really want to know what that means, if you could shed a little bit light on that. What does that mean, the residency thing?
Well, the residency or the 280E, the accounting thing?
No, the residency thing. You said that the residency thing is a problem in itself.
Well, it's a problem for the states, and the reason why is because you can't, as a state, you can't restrict other people from doing business in your state based on the fact that they're from another state. It's just not. It's not under our constitution. We don't allow for that. So you've got this problem where, and again, like without boring you to death with the constitutional law of it, it was to make it so that states didn't create restrictions that were protective of other states. So every state treats every other resident from another state the same. So if I come in, just because I haven't lived there for longer than a day, doesn't mean that I don't get the same fundamental opportunities as anybody else in your state. And I think states have said, well, that might be the law, but we're going to say no. And we're going to, for policy reasons, we're going to restrict this. And I think that it makes sense why they did it. And a lot of states, I think there's already been 3 or 4 cases where they basically said you can't do that, and the states are like, okay, we won't do it. But as each new state rolls out their program, they still do it, even though they know that these other states have already been told that it's not constitutional and they can't do it. So there you go.
Do you want to earn CPE credit? Take this course of MyCPE 1 to earn free credit. Click the link in the description to get started.
Interesting. Well, since we're talking about legislation, moving on to legislation, which is your forte, What are some common challenges you've encountered while drafting legislation for the new cannabis markets?
So my the hardest thing about working with legislature or working with legislation is getting in what you want, right? And so every time you're approached by legislators or you're approached by trade groups, and they say, well, what do we want in there? And so we can say everything that we want, but it's like a Christmas list, right? And it looks beautiful when you hand it over, but what you might get over time has to change or compromises and so forth. And a lot of times that can happen fast, and you have to kind of be involved in the process. I think the saying goes something to the effect of, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so you really have to be, if you don't integrate yourself into the political process every year, then you're potentially going to be harmed. And so a lot of times I've seen in different markets, because we work in multiple states, you see people say, well, everybody else is making a decision. What difference does it make? And it's like, it makes a difference. And so even if your difference is being involved in a trade group, or if it's being involved legislatively, like in whatever way you are, I think trade groups are kind of the most effective way for licensees or people that have licenses to kind of steer the ship. But every year, in every state, they are coming after cannabis, whether it's trying to tax them differently, tax them more, change what they can do, change what they can say, how they can say it. They're constantly really under attack. And what they want to be able to do is not only defend against those attacks, but then also find ways to move forward. They treat cannabis like plutonium, and it's regulated accordingly. Except I don't think plutonium even has a traceability program. And so you have the cannabis being really highly, highly regulated, and there's nothing wrong with that. We needed that in order to show that what we're doing was correct. But over time, and also to kind of show the feds that we had this under control. But I think that there's an ebb and a flow to that regulation for how harsh it needs to be versus how lax it needs to be. I think there's a middle ground there for every state. Some states start off on one end of the pendulum and others on the other. And you kind of are hopeful over time that pendulum just kind of evens out.
I mean, that's difficult, I mean, it's so challenging, with these challenges. How do you approach these hurdles, to ensure that the legislation supports a sustainable and an equitable market?
Well, in some ways, you kind of have to take it as it comes. I mean, there's times where there's been changes in the law where we've been really upset. And there's other times you can tell that the changes in the law, or the groups of people are preventing changes in the law because everybody kind of has their own interests, and that's why it's like I say, it's like these trade groups. A lot of times they can be splintered because they have their own separate interests, and so you have to kind of again, it just takes active involvement, which can be really challenging and arguably exhausting. You're already running a business that's really hard to keep open. You're wearing multiple hats. Maybe you're taking a few off and handing them to other people, but you're also trying to stay involved in this brand new market. But it's because it's a brand new market that doesn't have any established rules or regulations. You look at the liquor laws and liquor rules, and every progress that they make are these little tiny progressions, because it's been around for 100 years, and the same is true for so many other industries that are out there. This one is brand new, and they're trying to decide every day and every year, like what the proper legislation and what the proper rules should be. And the best way for you to make sure that that's equitable and that it has integrity is for you to be involved, or you as a licensee to be involved.
Yeah. You mentioned about, like wearing different hats and everything. So I guess it goes more beyond, you have to have some form of relationships in the industry with different kind of people. So what's happening, what's the buzz, and how it ties in, So, I mean, and as it is, building equitable relationships is pivotal for any industry, right? Especially one which is like young and fast growing as cannabis. There's so much happening, and it just can't be everywhere, right? So, from your experience, if you could just, because you've been there for a long time, so probably from your experience, what are the keys to establishing fair partnerships in this industry?
Oh, that's a tough one. Partnerships. Well, first of all, I should say, like, a lot of what we do at my firm is partnership litigation and investor litigation. So it's when everything went wrong, right? And so I love to tell you that because of all that litigation, it allows you to see around corners, but it does in so much as that you want to make sure the people that are in this industry, like when you think about it, it's like somebody that really truly loves the plant and is a farmer probably isn't wildly rich. And people that are wildly rich probably aren't much in the way of farming. And so you a lot of times those are the two groups that are being brought together. There's other, when you're on the retail side, I don't think you have as much need for financing. But when you're growing, especially when you're growing indoor, but even if you're growing outdoor, you need land, you need light, and you need water, and you need a lot of plants, and you need the expertise. And so the expertise you may have, but you don't have the money for all the other things. And so when you bring the money people together with the farming people, it's not oil and water, but they see the world differently. And so it's in some ways stepping out of your own shoes and trying to relate with those people and finding good partners. A lot of times people are just trying to find anyone that will finance this dream. And so they settle on either making deals with the devil or making deals and finding out later on they're with the devil. And in either case, it's like it can't always be prevented, but sometimes the best thing to do is to take your time in finding that right partner, and then also not giving up too much, because the money people, when they do come in, and they will, they're not always predatory, but they're always looking for the best possible advantage. And so as growers or people that are on the other side of that, they need to figure out how they're going to protect themselves. One of those ways is by having counsel on their side, but the other way is really just knowing. I mean, like I was told one client one time, I was like, why don't you just go out to dinner with them and see how they treat the wait staff? Like, I mean, that alone should tell you something. Like there's something to be said for how people treat people, and knowing that that's the kind of person you want to do business with. So that's kind of there's no magic to that, though. I know a couple of guys that grew weed in their mom's basement, and they're like practically millionaires. And I know guys that were captains of industry that got into deals with other people, and it was just a mess. And so I'd love to tell you that there's some formula, and because there's everything in between there, and it's just really, there is no real formula. There's just I wouldn't say there's luck either, but I do think that there is due diligence, which is taking that time to say, not just that they've got the money, but this is the right person to do business with. And it really goes to the investors too, because the investors get into these relationships with people that are just crazy. I mean, our industry, cannabis, has an inconsistent amount of people with, I wouldn't say mental health issues, but obviously you have to be a little bit crazy to be in cannabis, right? Everything we do is illegal, federally illegal, right? So
Federally illegal, yes.
every conversation I have with a client, the very first conversation is RICO. It's a conspiracy in furtherance to commit federal crimes. And so there's something to be said for the fact that you've got to be a little bit crazy. You decided to go break federal law, even if it seems safe. You've decided that that's going to be okay. Now again, it's probably like going, 57 miles an hour in a 55 mile per hour road, but the speed limit is the limit. That's the fastest you're supposed to go. It doesn't mean you're not breaking the law. And so I would say that your average person is fine, but we do have a lot of extra crazy people in our industry. And so kind of figuring that out and realizing that not all money is good money. Sometimes it's better just to walk away and find something else.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you rightly said, the grower and the investor, they both come from a different mindset. The grower has got some vested interest. He's been doing it, or he knows how, or he or she, they know how it needs to be done. They know what is needed and everything. Investors are usually looking at everything as it's a capitalist mindset, right? Investment, and what is your return on investment, and how soon can you make the money out of it and everything. Whereas growers know that this takes time, and then there is this delicate balance about how much patient can you be after you put in your money to wait for it to come back,
Right.
But yeah, and I mean, like you being a counsel, I'm pretty certain you must have been, aside so many such business partnerships, So if you may, could it be possible for you to share an example where this equitable business practices significantly impacted the business success in the cannabis industry?
I mean, it's kind of all over the place. Yeah, in some sense, you have to remember that the community that's coming into this in every new state, arguably, there's two groups of people: entrepreneurs that are just like, yes, let's do this, and outlaws, people that used to do this as a crime and decided that this was criminal. And amongst both of those communities are a lot of people with bad intentions or not good intentions or just not good people. And so we believe that, a lot of that can be fixed by A, getting to know your potential partner, and then B, drafting up documents that protect the parties and drafting up agreements that protect the parties on both sides, so that both sides have counsel and both sides see it. Because your formation documents for when you form your company are really going to speak to how things are going to go. Because we know one thing for sure: you're going to start making money or you're going to start losing money, and you're going to fight about something. And when you do, you can go back to this document and say, well, this is how we resolve these fights. There's, in every relationship, there's risk. How much is everybody going to put in, whether it's time or money, and how that is allocated. Return, who's getting that back? Am I going to get paid for the work I do? Am I going to get paid back for the money that I put in? And then, exit, like, how do we get out of this thing when we can't get along? And then expectations. What are everyone's expectations? Whether it's, or do we have, can we compete with our own company? And do you expect me to put in 40 hours a week? All of these things can be kind of explained. You could talk about all these things and get these things clarified right at the beginning of your relationship. And if you do, it will most certainly suck all the romance out of the room, right? Like, because now you're talking about the real things, right? It's kind of like getting a prenuptial agreement, right? It really just is like, we're talking about this tough stuff that I want to talk about what this looks like when it ends, instead of talking about like all the blue sky and the stars in our eyes. And so, but doing that, really beginning part of your partnership is going to help. Because the truth is that, the money people, really overvalue their money and the fact that, this could never have been done without my money. And the sweat equity people feel that, without me there every day doing the job and connecting with it, whatever, this could have never been done. And both of them are right and both of them are wrong. They both have value. It's just assessing that value early on so that everyone feels that they're on equal footing, and not misunderstanding kind of where they're coming from.
Absolutely, I agree to you. Now that's the relationship side of it, or I would say that's the human side of it. But then, like you had mentioned, there is a legal side of it, because this is a very complex legal thing. So let's talk about navigating those legal complexities. What I'm talking about is if I were to ask you, what are some prevalent legal issues for cannabis businesses today, and how do you navigate them? If you can tell a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, the first, of course, is what we already talked about, which is that first complexity is dealing with the partnership itself. The second complexity is dealing with your administrative agencies, which is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, which is dealing with whatever cannabis board your state is in. And for the most part, that can be really challenging for business owners, right? Like, where they're being told that they can't borrow money from a bank or borrow money from somebody from out of state, or that certain people can only be in this company, but only people that are in this state, or being told that they have to, for farmers, again, like maybe your former outlaws, how they have to tag each and every plant, and it has to be at this certain stage of growth, and it needs to have this kind of tag. So all that administrative agency complexity, and then dealing with all of these other agencies that you have to deal with if you're in a business. A lot of my clients, and arguably whoever your clients might be, are former outlaws. And so you're trying to reform them, right? You're reforming this outlaw into being like a law-abiding citizen, which means that they have to pay their taxes, that they have to do their accounting, that they have to do these things, and that they have to abide by all of these new rules, that they can't pay their clients with weed, or their employees with weed, I should say, or that they can't just sometimes behave the way that they normally got to behave because they were outlaws. Nobody was really calling into question how they did what they did, because they were kind of captains of their own pirate ship. But we're not pirates anymore. We're part of the system, for better or worse. It's kind of, ushering our clients in and reforming them so that they can make that change and do so in a meaningful way. And it's not easy for them. It's also giving some sympathy, some sort of understanding that this is hard for them,
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.
Indeed. No, it is, and, you had mentioned, you subtly mentioned that, like these are outlaws and now we are converting them or through a program, we are able to make them into law-abiding citizens. But that also means they need to pay their taxes. I mean, this is a little bit of off track, but, it just got me thinking that does one's history with tax returns affect if you're planning to enter into this market, does that history affect your eligibility to enter into this market as an investor, as a grower, or anything, or retailer?
It does and it doesn't. So here's some of the ways that it does. Like some of our clients are like, well, I ran a medical marijuana dispensary before. And so the money that I'm going to be investing is the money I have under my bed. It's $100,000 in cash. And so the thing is that most of these states want to forensically vet the money that's coming into the cannabis industry. For one, they want to know who it's coming from so that it's the right people that says that they are, but also that they want to know that it's not coming from, drug cartels and things like that. So they literally are forensically vetting. They're like saying, give me your bank records. Where did this deposit come from? Why are these deposits going? They ask those questions. They want to know where this money came from. And so, if you have $100,000 on your bed, we had to tell our clients, well, you need to go file taxes for that. Even if it's an amended report, I need you to go file taxes. Strangely, I've never seen any fallout for that. I suppose there could be, right? There is some risk there that the government says, well, why didn't you file that back in 2022 instead of now? But so far I haven't seen that, but they really had no choice. This was the only way this money was going to come in, is because the LCB or whichever cannabis agency you're going to be working with is going to say, where's that money coming from? So you have to file the taxes for it so that you can say, this is where it came from. Here's my tax return for it. Even if it's an amended, they'll accept that. And then I guess for the other thing that's coming up in some states, Oregon's one of the states that this came up in, and there's another state, I'm trying to recall, where the businesses aren't paying taxes that are in business now. And by virtue of that, they're not renewing their licenses. And so I think that I guess that stands to reason. The government wants their money, right? At the end of the day, those are accountants with guns and they don't wait for it. They're like, you either pay your taxes or you don't get a new license. And so that is happening in some states. And again, I think that this is an ongoing discussion with the government agencies and the licensees throughout the country. But in order for them to survive going forward, they're going to have to make some concessions on these taxes that they're taxing these people with. If 280E doesn't happen because or doesn't get reformed in some way, it's going to be really difficult for these people, these licensees, to be able to compete with the black market. And that is an important part of what they do, is to show that not that this is just safe cannabis and that it's pesticide free and that you can buy it in a safe place, but also that it's affordable. So those are some of the tax issues that kind of the licensees face.
And you mentioned about 280E, right? I know it's a very big topic, and I would not want you to tell me everything about it, because that would probably take another, many hours. But for the uninitiated, because there are going to be people who are still trying to understand this industry. What is this 280E? And why is it important for the industry?
I'm not a tax lawyer, so I'll limit my statements to a very broad view of it, which is to say that it's what it says is that if you're engaged in federally illegal conduct, you do not get to use tax write-offs that a normal ordinary business would get to write off. So each year I get to write off certain things because I'm a business, and so certain percentages of what I do get written off. And cannabis companies do not get to do that. They do not get to use those.
So you're not allowed to deduct your expenses, which other businesses are allowed to do. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah, so that makes it wildly. So you're already being punished. Like for example, states, are already taxing them between 15 and 30%. Some states as high as 38%, 35% for the states that's coming out of every dollar. And then on top of that, you don't get to write off anything else. So it's just a wildly high tax system. So you're still getting taxed with zero write-offs.
Wow. So it's everything that you receive, you get taxed at it. But come to think of it, that brings me a very interesting point, because I know that, I could be wrong because I'm not in the industry, neither in the legislation. I do know that, you are not allowed to you can't open a bank, so it's all
Right.
a cash regulated industry.
Isn't it? It isn't. It isn't. There are in almost every state that we work in, and we've seen at least one bank has stepped forward, but they're small credit unions, right?
Yes.
And they have very, very limited, and they vet people at in the same way that you would be vetted by the state itself. And if you answer one question wrong, you just lost your only opportunity to do banking, which means you are an all cash industry. But the other side of it is with the retailers, even though they have banks, they don't have access to Visa or MasterCard.
Yeah.
So anybody that's showing up to pay with a Visa or MasterCard, they're pointing them to an ATM machine in the same building and saying, use that right over there. There are a few workarounds by a few companies, but generally speaking, Visa and MasterCard have zero interest in providing rails to the retailers to use their cards. And for that reason, there is still a ton of cash, being generated and moved around back and forth by these people, even if they have a bank that they might be able to bank with. There still is and so we saw like over the last several years, we've seen a lot of situations where retail stores are being robbed, one after another, and it's been really tough. And by the way, crazy as this sounds, they get robbed. I have one of my clients that was robbed, we'll just say for tens of thousands of dollars, and they still had to pay taxes to the state for the money that was stolen from their safe.
Oh, because you're not allowed to deduct it as,
and it's not their money, right? They're holding that money in trust for the state. So the
Yeah.
state's like, well, you still need to pay me that money. So they get robbed twice. It's just terrible.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Just a curious question. Someone told me that there is nothing in this world that you cannot insure. Does insurance help in this matters?
Insurance can help, but I don't know that any of the insurance companies do anything for retailers for being robbed. The insurance that they end up buying is, getting armed security guards and things like that, which that isn't like the vibe that you want to give when you're trying to bring people into a welcoming space in an already stigmatized industry. And then you've got a guy with a gun in the front. It's like, that kind of takes the sunshine out.
Yeah, it does. No, it does. It does. We have talked about so many things. We have talked about when you're trying to get it started, the relationships, the hurdles there. Then also when you're doing the business, we talked on so many things. You actually gave a very nice picture. Like if you're going to be doing it, there is security costs, there are other costs, and then there's a tax implication that you will have to pay the taxes irrespective of whether that, and then we certainly touched on the banking side. So, that was really interesting. But, there's so much buzz, I'm checking on the forums as well, there's always somebody or the other saying, hey, I got money, I want to enter into this industry. This is not like, like those Shark Tanks where, a venture capitalist can just say, hey, come here, project me your business proposal and I'll sell it. Everybody knows there's a business out there. There are people who want to do it, but they just don't know how to do it because they're not aware of the legal risks, So this is for those new entrants, who want to get into the cannabis market, So what advice would you offer to those new entrants in the cannabis market for managing their legal risks?
Well, first of all, there's good news and bad news. The good news is you still can enter this industry for not a huge cost. The bad news is it might not be where you want to be. In other words, for these states that already have mature markets that have been opened, they almost, with very few exceptions, they've opened and closed their licensing opportunity. So it happened in 2016 or it happened in 2018. or it happened in 2020, where they said, we're opening licensing up. And in some cases, they restricted it to certain types of people. They said, well, you could be already a medical marijuana dispensary. Other states, they just said you need to be a resident. In other states, they didn't have, they almost always had a residency element to it. But whether they had other restrictions, like you need to be this or that. I think in Florida, you had to be a nursery if you wanted to own a grow. You had to be a nursery that's been around for X amount of years and so on and so forth. So each state has its own restrictions on whether you can get in or not. And then oftentimes, even if everybody gets in, sometimes it's a lottery. So even if you were the perfect candidate, they might say, well, now we're going to pick your name out of a pile. Now, this kind of sets aside the social equity applicants. But just overall, once that opportunity opens and then closes, now these licenses become like taxi medallions. They're basically super valuable, and there's a finite number of them. And so what happens is if you want one of them, you need to buy your way. So a license that somebody applied for in 2015 for $1,500 might be worth $150,000 or $250,000, just the license alone, not anything that goes with it, business-wise. So if you want to get into a market and in the state that you're in, you might be faced with a cost that you can't afford, or maybe you can, all right, for you. And then for those states where it's new, you're going to need to know that you have the qualifying conditions, which are that you're a resident, probably, and then also that you can get past the lottery or what other requirements they have. So that's the excuse me, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead.
That's the how you would get in. Then in terms of the market itself, it's there's kind of like there's 4 or 5 categories, but there's basically producers, people that grow the cannabis, processors, people that do something else with it, make it into oils or edibles, delivery, and then transportation, and sometimes distribution, and then lastly, retail.
Correct.
And even then, we used to have this, for the first couple of years, we were like, well, clearly the retailers are the ones making all the money. Somehow they've managed to control it. So like, that's which didn't make sense before everything kind of came out. You would think, well, I'll create a brand and I'll be in every store. I don't want to be, just in 3 stores. I want to be in every store. And, you can only have, so many stores, but I could be in all of them. But at the end of the day, it ended up being that generally speaking, the most successful people ended up being on the retail side of the industry, which is surprising. But like anything, there's always exceptions. In California, retailers are getting killed over there because it's like they have such a strong black market there of people running brick and mortar sales that even if they raid 100 of them, 70 of them open up the next week in the same place. And in New York, it's even worse. So you're talking about 2 of the most densely populated, hugest states in terms of population in the country, where you should just be printing money if you open up a retail. And in New York, it's the same thing. They have at every bodega, you can't, throw a rock without hitting a new place that's selling marijuana, without any repercussion, and they don't have any license whatsoever. So there's so many people in New York and California that are selling cannabis retail-wise illegally that the market is almost impossible to survive in. And so whereas you would say that you have a model and you're like, well, it's clearly, if you're going to go into this new state, this is what you should do. The answer is there's no magic thing. You just kind of have to look around and see what's happening.
Well, yeah, absolutely. No, Aaron, before we move towards concluding this, I have to ask you this question, which may be a little bit off track again, but like, if you could share with me one story from your past, like one incident from your past, wherein you had you weren't sure whether this would work. Like, a client came to you and like, I want to do this, and you were not sure whether it would work, but it worked. And one case in which you were 100% sure that this is going to go through because I've checked off all the boxes. This license will go through, and this, this will happen, but it did not happen. And what did you learn out of it?
Let's see. So a crazy case that I thought we would be fine with and be able to get control of, and it really was just spun out of control super quick. Had to do more with it was a trademark issue in litigation, where we had a client that clearly owned this mark and been doing this work and ran this brand, and done so very successfully. Had two employees who were fired, and then they proceeded to go and file for their trademark with the state and get the trademark, and then file with the USPTO, and they turned around and took their filing of the trademark and said, we're this company now.
Oh my God.
Don't do business with them. And if you do, we're going to sue you. Now,
Oh
these
my
two
God.
guys were just like a couple of guys that were like, just like with their mom's internet connection and a keyboard, were able to, devastate this company. And so we immediately filed a lawsuit. They responded with an attorney. I mean, for us, it was like an open and shut case. There was no question about it that we had the mark. But the presumption, because our client hadn't filed the mark yet, was that they were the ones that held the mark. And so we had to litigate the matter. And it took about 18 months before we got a resolution. We won.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, the damage was done, right? Like they had lost, relationships with businesses. They lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in sales. And these two guys were judgment proof to start with. So when we sued them, it was like, they were like, we don't have anything. I drive a Honda and live in a 1-bedroom apartment. So it was kind of like a cautionary tale for the importance of protecting your intellectual property, because filing a state trademark is not something you necessarily need a lawyer for. You can, but at the state level, state trademark applications are fairly easy, and it would have protected them tremendously. But unfortunately, hindsight is 20/20, right? So, and then it's another story. Another story, like a more cautionary tale than anything, would be is that, again, we're dealing with, outlaws. And so a lot of times people are selling things and not necessarily disclosing what they're truly selling. So in a lot of markets, they're saying, well, I'm selling you this license, but then you find out it's not a state license that they're selling. They're selling a medical cannabis endorsement. Or in one instance, there was a gentleman who had sold his license to 3 different people.
Oh my God.
And there was none of us knew about the other one. And so we're making this deal to buy this license. We release the funds, and he takes off. He left the country. We were able to actually track him down and get a resolution. But what a mess. And again, there's just no amount of due diligence necessarily that can sometimes uncover the things that people are doing with bad intent. And so you just have to be careful. I learned from that, but you have to be careful.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking ahead based on the current trends, what predictions can you make about the future of the cannabis markets?
Oh, that is a great story. I was in a speaking engagement back in 2011 with my mentor, Jeffrey Steinborn, and that same question was asked to me, and I was like, I believe in the next 5 years that we will have probably federally legal cannabis. And Jeffrey Steinborn, he leaned over to me and he said, "Oh, you're on the 5-year plan too." And so afterwards, I asked him what that was about. He's like, "Yeah, I've been on the 5-year plan since 1979." And I was like, okay, I get it. It does make sense to say we're 5 years away, right? Because it just almost always seems within reach.
Yes.
But one thing I've learned really is that the problem with cannabis and its legalization issue is that it is a legal problem and it's a political problem. And I've learned, if nothing else, in the last 10 years of my life, that I can't predict what's going to happen in politics. It is just impossible for me to predict what's going on or what's going to happen next. And so I leave predictions for, I guess, the tarot card readers. I just try and do everything we can to influence the outcomes for our clients at a local level, and try and protect them as business owners.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Aaron, it's been incredibly enlightening discussing these topics with you today. Okay, your insights not only shed light on the complexities of the cannabis market, but also offer hope and direction for the future. I didn't mean just staring into the crystal balls and tarot readers, but yeah. But thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope this episode has given you a deeper understanding of the emerging cannabis markets and the legislative framework that shapes them. For more episodes like this, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasts. Until next time, keep exploring and stay informed. Cheers.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.